Hello and welcome to this episode of the Wealth Alchemist podcast. My name is Carrie Norley. I am your host of the show. And today I have one of my beautiful, beautiful soul sisters on the show with me. She started her journey as an occupational therapist in a busy neurorehabilitation unit with both adults and pediatrics. And it was working with newborns where she developed her love for craniosacral therapy with pregnancy and newborns. I love cranio. It's so amazing. She ran her own private bodywork practice for 10 years. She has modalities such as womb work, pre and perinatal trauma resolution, trauma-informed somatics, psychosomatics, family constellations, emotional clearing, energetic healing, yoga, and attachment theory. She specializes in holistic trauma release techniques, nervous system regulation techniques, womb healing, and birth imprinting and repatterning. She believes that when we address these pillars, we restore our resiliency and allow the body to return to its natural state of thriving and pure potentiality. Oh my God, I love this. She totally strives to hold a safe space and container. She's amazing at that. And she offers her body work as well as online somatic coaching, helping women connect to their bodies, guided womb journeys, process pre and postnatal birth imprints, conception, and the nourishment of the nervous system. All I'm going to say is Lesh has been, wow. I don't want to talk about you to start, as I always love sharing my friends. I met Lesh when we were at my spiral practitioner training. She was an assistant there on the retreat for me. And to have watched you over the last, it's been 3 years.
Wild,
3 years, right? 3 years.
Crazy.
Like
crazy.
And I'm going to say this because for those of you who are listening, like sometimes time can feel freaking forever and we feel like we're not making any changes in our lives. When I can sit here and I know that you guys might not be looking at Lesh, but I'm looking at Lesh and I can tell you what I know from both of our lives and how much we have drastically changed in our lives. It is because of this work, because of the work that she's doing. It's because of the emotional clearing work that we do. It's because of the continual practice of diving into the depths of where we're going to take you today in this conversation that her life has transformed dramatically. And we have both come from these, like, how do I even describe, like, fierce masculine and not in a good way.
Unintegrated masculine.
Totally unintegrated masculine. Totally not in a great way. But man, we were out there into these really beautiful, softened women who are also in our absolute power. And so I'm super excited to have this conversation. And I say this because, like, all of this to introduce it, because wherever you are on this journey, like, this conversation is a really important conversation. And I say this because looking at least 3 years later and knowing how much this type of work has changed our lives, I invite you into wherever you are, like, don't give up. Don't give up. Like, there is a transformation in front of you. Right?
So well said. Yeah.
So actually, I don't think I said your name. So welcome to the show, Miss Lesha Nelson. It's beautiful to have you here.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a long time in the making.
Yes. So let's first start out with, because I know, like, for me, when I first started learning about trauma work, I used to think, and I think this is common for a lot of people, I wasn't, like, left black and blue and purple, and I wasn't hit by cars, and I wasn't sexually abused, and I didn't have all these big, huge traumatic experiences. Right. And, like, I had my own traumas, but they were not the way that when I thought of trauma, this is what trauma is. Like, I have to be left, like, at a hospital black and blue to be traumatized. So I would love for you to explain, because this is not what the truth is, by the way, people. I would love for you to explain what trauma actually is before we get into the conversation around it.
Sure. For me, I'm going to share a little bit of how I kind of woke up to this myself. Was actually flying to Bali, which you and I went to Bali together. I don't even know when that was on the timeline, the last 3 years, but I was reading a book on an airplane about trauma resolution, and he started to talk about neglect and went into his own personal story of neglect. And, not to say that, like, I was homeless or I was, like, completely neglected as a child. I definitely had needs filled. And there were also some really big holes in my childhood around neglect that I never recognized the ripple effect of that. And I was reading this book going, holy shit, I am dealing with some major neglect pieces from my teenage years mostly. And the ripple effect that has played into my life means I'm showing up in the world a certain way, or I have certain belief patterns that are totally subconscious and what felt like out of my control because of those experiences as a teenager. And so same with me, Carrie, like I wasn't beat black and blue. I don't have a history of being sexually assaulted or sexual trauma. That doesn't mean I don't have pieces in my life that are considered traumatic. And it also is really important for me because there are people that have experienced what I call big T trauma. So
Yeah,
these
totally.
are like sexual assaults, car accidents. When people like me talk about little T trauma, kind of those little smaller things, it can sometimes create this like uncomfortableness in the conversations, you know. So I like to talk about trauma as big T and little t. We know from research that trauma has an effect on the brain. We know that little t trauma, these little scars over and over and over, such as being bullied, small, but every day, again and again and again, it has the same impact as someone who does experience a big T trauma.
Ah, yes.
I also think it's important to share that trauma is not the same as PTSD. Those are very different diagnoses, technically. And PTSD has certain symptoms, certain things that you have to quote unquote check off the box, last 6 months or longer in order to be considered as PTSD. And so we can have trauma, we can have big T trauma, little t trauma, and not have PTSD. The two don't have to go hand in hand. We can have traumas and also have PTSD. So I like to explain trauma is having one of 4 aspects or maybe a combination, but essentially our body can't digest what's happening to us. So we have an experience.
That's such a beautiful way of saying that, Leash. Your body can't digest what's happening to you. Feel that, people.
Yeah. So something happens and we can't digest it. And so it might be happening to us. Our body is still experiencing it. It's creating a memory. It's creating muscle memory. It's creating tissue memory. And this is how it gets stored in the body. But we might not be registering it because we're not digesting it. And so oftentimes we're not digesting something because things are happening too fast, like a really fast pace. So it's like, I use a cake analogy for this actually. So if you have a whole cake in front of you and you're going to digest it, if you're eating the cake like double forked really, really, really fast, your body is going to be like, I can't. Right?
Eventually, yes. I can't do anymore.
Eventually. Your body's going to be like,
unfortunately, because you went through so fast, you ate too much, and now you're really, really mad at yourself.
Yeah. Which is the next one. Too much. You're like, oh, fuck, I just had a whole cake. Too much.
I can't move now.
This is like going to make me forget what the 4 are too, because this is so funny. Too much, too fast, too soon. So you're like, I'm not ready for cake, but I'm going to eat the whole thing anyway, even though I just had a Thanksgiving dinner. So it's too soon. And the body can't take that on. And then not enough. And it's like, that's the case of like neglect. It's like, well, I actually really do want cake, but there's no cake there for me to have. And so one of those 4 things is usually happening or a combination, and then we can't digest it. And then trauma.
It's so interesting. I mean, I'd like to just add my thoughts on what you're saying around digest it, because I think it's a beautiful word that I can understand. And I think you understand. But I want to add to that, as for those who might not relate to that word, for me, digest it means that you bring it into your body, you experience it in your body, and you move it through your body. So like, we feel like if something happens, like even now, right, you might have some sort of experience that happens, you're like, whoo, and your body feels like you feel something like that rush in your body, and it triggers something off, which could be the fight or flight, or, you know, your different responses to the trigger. And then it's in that moment that you can feel it in your body and go, okay, where is this in my body? Let me be with this in my body. And then ask your body, how does it want to move this in your body? Does it want to breathe this? Does it want to dance this? Does it want to scream this? Like, if it has to, right? Like, this is how we move things through and digest it, like at a deeper level of things. And I think sometimes when we catch things in that moment, you can take it and digest it and move it, and it doesn't actually then stay stuck in your body.
Yeah. The word that comes to me with digestion is assimilation.
Yes.
So assimilation is when like you eat something, the nutrients take it and it simulates the villi of your intestines, absorb it, and does all this processing, and you've assimilated it. So can you assimilate what's happening? Can you make sense of what's happening? And if things are happening too much, too fast, too soon, we can't really make sense of what's happening. And it's not to say, I loved your example. It's like, can I feel it? Can I move through it? Can I breathe? There's times where you might have kids, you might be in a really busy business meeting, you might have a million things going on. And so in that moment, you can't necessarily do that.
Yes. Yeah.
But you can do it at the end of your day and have the same results. Like before you go to bed, take a few moments, make sense of what happened, maybe process with a partner, maybe do some breath work, assimilate it, move it, and it's not going to get stored into the body. And also to add, that's not necessarily going to be the trauma, but it's like, are you having a business meeting where you're constantly taking assault from your boss? Like that's little t trauma. And over time, that's going to wear out your system. And over time, it's going to be harder and harder to make sense of it and assimilate that and move forward.
Because it gets so normal.
It's so normal. And resiliency plays a big role here. That's a word that you haven't necessarily said yet, but there can be two people. You and I can experience the exact same experience, the exact same trauma, say a car accident. And let's say where I am in my life, I'm in a really good place in my life. Things feel good. I have a lot of support systems. I can move through the accident and have it not be considered a trauma. I have resiliency. For whatever reason, I was born that way. And then let's say you're in a rough point in your life. You don't have a lot of support. You don't have previous resilient coping mechanisms, and you don't make it through the car accident as well. And it is traumatic for you. So that's another fascinating piece about trauma.
Yeah. So interesting. I would like to take this into one of your specialties, speaking of trauma, because, and I've worked with you in this actually, like Lesha and I've already actually done some birth work together. One of the things that you are absolutely amazing at is working with womb spaces, with pregnancy, with birth trauma. And I would love to hear more about all of what that is and what that importance of what that is. So like birth, let's start with birth trauma.
I was going to say, like,
that's a lot. That was a big thing. We're going to start with birth trauma. I'm going to bring this down. We're chunking.
Okay. So birth trauma, what I call pre and perinatal trauma resolution, that's kind of the medical word. I call it birth imprints or birth blueprints. Your blueprint is really, we all have a blueprint of wellness. Like we are born whole, complete human beings with the ability to love and just be on this planet from a heart-centered place. That's our blueprint. What happens when we come to this planet, and whether it's preconception, conception, pregnancy, or our birth, is we can have imprintings into our system. And, if it's a birth trauma, we were just talking about trauma, right? Same thing. If something's happening to you as you're being born, things are happening too fast, too much, too soon, not enough, that gets imprinted on your system. And that imprint overrides the blueprint. And because this is happening to you as an infant, you don't have language. You don't have a frontal cortex that's developed. You don't have that ability to be like, oh, I'm going to make sense of this at the end of the day and do some breath work. It's like you're an infant. You're completely dependent on other people. And so we, as infants, we really tune into what's the caregiver doing. We're totally dependent upon our moms, our dads. So we're tuning to their system. So if there is a birth trauma and we as a baby are experiencing these intense moments of birth, which the United States, unfortunately, we have one of the worst rates of birth trauma for a first world country. And the mom is also experiencing trauma of her own. The baby is attuning to a dysregulated nervous system. If the doctors, nurses, doulas, midwives, if they are in the room and don't have regulated nervous systems as well, like if there's no one in the room, which often is the case, that's tracking the energy, tracking the nervous systems, attuning to regulated nervous systems, the baby's coming into the world under really wild circumstances. And it gets imprinted, like imprint, it gets imprinted in our implicit memory, which is like the memory of the body. It's like the memory that doesn't have a language. And then years later, we have an experience, or we have a feeling, or we have a thought. And depending, it can come from your birth, your conception, your time in utero, depending.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. And, I fell into this on a cranial sacral table, actually. I was in course, I was learning in class, and I remembered my birth. And I remembered my birth from my body. Like my body remembered my birth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what the fuck is happening? And I ended up going through this whole process of remembering my birth and then choosing to do it differently as part of healing it.
It's so beautiful. So beautiful. It's interesting because when you said that, like one of the things that I wanted to bring to this conversation actually is around energy being stored in our body. I'm going to say it that way. And it's come up a few times in here. And I thought I would bring it more directly into the conversation in that, like, so I mean, I don't know if I've ever said this on here. Maybe I have, that I was a body worker for years. I did myofascial work and years spent in this. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that we carry emotions in our body. And I know as a body worker myself, like when you touch points, it will bring an emotion. Sometimes something will touch. I mean, if you're here listening and you're not a body worker, but if you experience body work, somebody might touch you and you might laugh. Somebody might touch you and you might cry, or you might not cry because you don't let yourself, but you might have the sensation that you might want to cry or you might want to scream, or you might want to do these things. And it's because that's a spot in your body where we've stored some piece of an emotion that we have held on to versus releasing it and letting it go. And so this is part of, like, I think that, where we hold our imprints is what you're saying, right? Is in our body. And it's magical. Like our body is always speaking to us, and we can always, if you stop and listen, your body will tell you what it needs and what's going on for it. And so I just think it's a really interesting piece right here to just play into. What is your body speaking to you? Where are you? If you're in places where you're like, oh, this, and I think this is where movement comes so beautifully too. Like this point right here is a little bit sticky. What's there? Like, how can I be in that space? How can I release this spot? And allowing yourself in those situations to move through whatever shows up for you, because that's the release, and we don't have to have like Leash said, I was in craniosacral and you went through your birth experience. I definitely have had experiences like that too with my myofascial work. And like, it's powerful, and like rebirthing through the birth canal and going through it again. And yeah, for anyone who's listening, like just play into, like, even if you're not seeing or going through these birth experiences, it could just be like this moment of like, the sigh, or, oh, like whatever that bubbling thing is, allow it to show up for you and to move it. Cause that's where you'll start to release this stuff.
Memories.
I'm like, what's the word? Find that word for me.
Well, like I just shared this story on my Instagram where I am so triggered. I'm like really working through this really big piece around like self-worth and work. And I've always had this like deep ingrained issue around that. And it seems like no matter what I do, I can't quite shift it, or I can't quite change it. And I was in this little weekend course doing some birth work on myself. And I just had this premonition, and I called my dad and was like, hey, Dad, did you ever lose your job when Mom was pregnant with me? What's going on? And he said, yeah, actually, I lost my job a month before you were born.
Wow.
And your mom was so stressed out, and like it triggered her so much because she didn't work. I was the fourth kid. Suddenly, here comes the fourth child, no health insurance. This is in the 80s. No income. And we ended up having to move when I was, I think, 3 months old after being born, because my dad couldn't find another job. And I was like, thanks, Dad. I kind of felt like I knew that, but it was so confirming, because I was like, God, this isn't even my story. This is just the environment I was born into. And these are all of my mom's emotions that I was feeling 8 months in utero. And the first 3, 4, 5, 6 months of my life was born into this really stressful environment all around work and money.
How fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting here that you actually bring that, because let's talk about a little bit about like generational trauma, right? That we carry through and through our womb.
Right.
Oh my God, did they bring it together for you?
Well, we know that, I mean, I think maybe not everyone of your listeners has heard this, but when your grandma has your mom in her belly, all of your mom's eggs are developed, which means you as an egg were in your grandma's belly. So that just shows the connection of 3 generations, you, your mom, your grandma, and how profound that is. And we know from epigenetic research, there is so much to play about our DNA and what we feel and what we experience because of our family. And then we're going to talk about energy again. Family constellation work, when I was going through that certification program, which is where you look at a family system as like a whole system, we were working on stuff generations back, beyond 7 generations. So everyone says like, oh, 7 generations forward, 7 generations back. In my mind, I'm like, no, we do it. We carry all of it. Like we're working on stuff, carrying stuff through generations, years, thousands of years back can show up. Just how I had that premonition that there was something around my dad and work. There are things that can happen in the timeline, witch wound, for example.
Oh yeah, the witch wound. Ooh.
Yeah. We feel and show up a certain way today because of that experience thousands of years ago. We just do. It's in our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Hey, by the way, for those of you who don't know, the witch wound is the wound where we've been witches in the past. We've been burned at the stake, and maybe you've had a little bit of fear of being in your witchiness because maybe in a past life, in some other time, you were burned at the stake for being the fullness of who you are in your witchiness. Yeah, we still feel that.
Or you weren't burned at the stake, but in order to not be burned at the stake, you had to hide.
You had to hide.
That's how your family line made it through, right?
Yes.
Even if we're not even talking about past lives, because again, sometimes it's like, God, there's so much. There's my birth imprints. There's my generational lines. There's my past lives. And so coming back to that point of like, just being curious and present about what's here right now. If something's coming up in your life, if you're going, like in your example, Carrie, you were saying like, that's why dance is so great, or you get into a movement or a position. We don't have to go, quote unquote, hunting for all these problems or all these issues. That to me is a sign of feeling like you have to fix yourself, and we really don't. Because again, we're blueprints, we're already whole. And if you're moving through your life, something's happening, something feels sticky in your body or in your mind, that's where we bring our attention and our awareness and our curiosity. It's like, okay, what's here now? Let's be curious with this, and let's just be open and see what comes up. And it might be this, and it might be that, might be transgenerational. Who cares? Let's just be with what it is.
So beautiful. So how does all of this information about trauma and the imprints that it's had on our lives, how is it affecting our lives now? Like, how do we see this play out in our lives now? Like, how does it actually also put a pause or a stopper or like stuff in the way of creating our dreams?
Yeah, I think the witch wound is a great example. You know, it's like something happened in the past, whether ancestrally or generationally or past life. Something happened, you got hurt, you died, you were ridiculed because of it. Here you are now. And you're like, well, last time I did that, I died. And if you even just want to keep it in this lifetime, like when I did that as a child, I got in trouble.
Or if you're like, one of the things I would like that's coming to me right now is because this happened to me totally. Like I was painting or doing some crafty thing, and the art teacher is like, they wouldn't have said you suck, but basically said you suck. And that imprints, right? And so then that stops us from wanting to be in our fullest expression, because when you've been in that state and you're like, I've just been told that I had this beautiful thing that I was so excited about, and the teacher who I idolize because they're my teacher just told me that I suck. That's an imprint, but that's an experience, right? And it's interesting because I always said when I was looking to become a mother, and this was a big thing for me. So it's like, I don't want to carry on stuff and see my kids repeat patterns. So it wasn't until I actually felt, oh, I'm changing things in my life that this feels good enough to, and then I watch all these parents, I'm laughing at myself for saying good enough right now. And then I watch all these parents want to like cotton wool children. And I have definitely tried to do this too, right? And like protect children and da da da. And I'm like, but the thing is, or, I don't want to take this part of my life. I don't want to be in, this is a big one for moms, right? I don't want to go live my passion because my kids need me. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about it is that I wanted to give them more, like that I knew that I wanted to give them that. But at the same time, I was like, I know that I can't control what's that one moment. The teacher that says this, the me that says like that, generally speaking, 90% of the time, 99, whatever it is percent of the time, I'm pretty, amazingly choicey in my linguistics of words. But that time where they freaking piss you off and you say something and you go off your head at them because every single mother in the world has done it. Don't freaking shame yourself for it. Right. Yep. You don't know which one of the weird and random things. And it could even be something you thought was amazing. Like I'm doing this thing for my kid and it like landed in them in this way that was like, oh, I don't want that. That took my power away or whatever it was. And so for me, it was like this invitation to just be like, all right, I don't know what it's going to be for them. None of us know any of these places in our lives where we're going to be like, yep, that's the thing. And now I'm going to stop you from doing this thing over here because it might mean that you're going to have something that affects you later in your life.
Right. And I mean so that's kind of like the first part of your question combining with the second is like, what's stopping you? Well, it's that time that I was told I really sucked at something and I internalized that and I made it my reality. We may or may not even remember those moments, but they're running in our subconscious, they're running in our body. And so I think that's more the like blocks. And there's this other concept called, this is an attachment theory word, good enough parenting. To have good enough parenting, which research shows is really only about 30%. Like that's actually all we need in order to be like functional adults in the world, like to make it. Right. And so it's like, I had more than 30%. I know that. And there were still incidences. I'm actually working through one personally right now where there are incidences that are a big enough thing that someone said, or your mother did, or something happened within relationship, because it's usually relational when you're a child, that then creates this pattern or this ripple effect. And so for me, it comes like the thing that ties it all together is regulated nervous systems and attachment styles, really. Because if you are that parent, just remember, as I say this though, 30%, you're that parent screaming at your child every day because you have a dysregulated nervous system that is going to affect their attachment style.
Totally.
Is it to say they're going to grow up and end up in prison? Probably not. And it's like, what do we need to focus on so that that parent can have a regulated nervous system so they aren't yelling at their kid every day, so that they can have a better relational field and better attachment style?
Yahoo. So talk to us about nervous system regulation, my dear.
Yeah.
What is that? It's a huge concept.
Huge. I was just going to say that. I was like, well, we could talk for like an hour.
Right. So just talk about like, what does it actually mean to have a regulated nervous system?
Yeah, I use the word window of tolerance a lot. And our window of tolerance is our ability to have regulated nervous system. We aren't hyperactive. We're not anxious. We're not freaking out. And we're not disassociated, disconnected, or hypoactive. So if we think about hypo kind of sitting down below, hyper sitting up above, the window of tolerance is the space between the two. And there's play within that. So meditation sits on this lower end of the spectrum. You're calm, you're relaxed. There might be a touch of disconnecting or disassociation depending on your style of meditation, but you're still in your window of tolerance and still have a regulated nervous system. Play, and the reason why play is so important, plays on the high end, but it's still contained. Like you're having fun, you're joyous, there's more movement, there's more activity, but you're not tipping up into that freaked out, anxious state. And there's a fine line for kids if you watch this.
Right. And it happens in like a split second. Any mom knows it. You're like, went past the point.
Totally past the point. And that's the window of tolerance. And my window of tolerance is going to be different than someone else's window of tolerance. It's plastic, meaning it can change over time. And so really what we want to make sure we're doing is spending most of our time within that window of tolerance. And the way trauma resolution works, and the way that regulating your nervous system works when I'm working with people, we are playing with what's called the edge, or the just right challenge, where you're in your window of tolerance, but you're taking something outside of it, and we're holding both at the same time, or we're bouncing back and forth between the two in a very safe, regulated way. And the more we do that, the more we start to be able to understand our own nervous systems, the more trauma resolution we have, and the larger our window of tolerance can get.
So ultimately with that, what your intention is that we're opening up the tolerance window. So like, if I can just push a little bit past, because if I try and push past like at 100%, I'm going to go into complete burnout. If I try and push past at 5%, then my body can handle that and we can stretch it.
Yeah. Like a really simple example is I was with a friend who has a 18-month-old, and we were meal prepping. We decided to get together and make some food. And her toddler was in the sink, basically just like having bath time, playtime while we were cooking. I'm like super energy conservation woman. And so this whole time we're cooking, the water's running, which dysregulates my nervous system in the background. Because in the background, I'm like, oh my God, we're wasting so much water right now. And then the other part of me is, this is great because her child's occupied, she's having fun, she's in play. And so what I'm doing is I'm meal prepping, is I'm leaning into like, this is really uncomfortable for me. I'm going to breathe through the fact that we're wasting gallons and gallons of water when we live in a drought in Utah. And at the same time, I'm going to lean into the fact that I'm here cooking with my friend and her toddler's having a really good time. And that's going to expand my window of tolerance.
It is.
That's my edge.
It is. You know, it's interesting. I think this is a huge piece. I know I've been traveling through it a lot, and I know many people on the planet right now with all of the, if we look at the global agendas and the global things that are going on in the world, and with all the intensity of what's happening in the world right now, I feel there's been so many people who've had to like, how do I be in the contraction of what's going on in the world, but also the expansion of what's here? And there's so much. I don't know anyone who I've been speaking to lately of our friends, like, you know, people in circles and things that don't have these two polars running almost at the same time. And I think this is part of, for me, this has been a really huge thing for me in the overcoming the tendencies of bipolar stuff. And I really want to speak to this here because I think it was a big mindset shift in my world of, if I swing to these two extremes, right? I'm really high, and it can be really high in pleasure and anxiety or whatever. And it could also be dropped down into like complete and utter, like, I just want to stay into my bed and never get out. And so for me, it was never like, because I remember when somebody said to me, Carrie, it's not going to necessarily be something that, you know, I could have gone and had medication and done it that way. For me, it was like, how do I regulate myself and be able to live in knowing that I can hold all of this? And so for me now, it's like my tolerance window is actually probably, I would almost say, lessened in the way that I do my work to keep it from going to extremes, so that I can actually hold, oh, okay, I'm in this part here that's actually really uncomfortable. And I'm in this part here that's really full of joy, and I can feel it all. And I'm not going to go and explode, and I don't have to take it out on another human being. And I can just be with it. And the more that I can actually sit with it and in the experience of it versus actually try and avoid it or fly into it with complete and utter unawareness, right? Because that's what I would have done, complete and utter unawareness. Then I have a more regulated nervous system because I have to in order to hold it all, right? And I meet my kids totally differently. Totally differently. And even when I do the things, I mean, it's so minimal now compared to a dysregulated nervous system that just goes freaking off your face. And honestly, any mom who's here, any parent that's here has done it, I'm sure. But I think it's a really interesting piece to really sit with, is like, how do we, because we all have all of this. We all have all of this within us. And so it's never about avoiding what's in it. It's about how do we actually be with it and be okay with it.
Totally. And the way of the world, because the world is so crazy right now, So many people have never learned this skill. So many people have not learned really how to regulate their nervous system. There's something called the FOX, or the fake window of tolerance, where you think you're in your window of tolerance, but you're actually not, because you've been so dysregulated that when you think you're regulated, you're actually not even regulated.
It's true.
It's true. And that's
100%.
how we live. And we're 2 years post a pandemic. We're at wars. Like, the world is crazy. And so many people right now, this is what I'm noticing, is they're trying to live their life how they lived their life 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And we can't. We can't anymore, because everything that's happening is so much more chaotic, and we haven't learned how to be in our bodies or learned how to be in our nervous systems. And so the antidote to that is to slow down.
I know.
And so to minimize the outside noise, get a little bit what I call small, so that you can start to actually heal the nervous system and understand what your body's doing and understand your window of tolerance. And at first it sucks. You're like, I'm supposed to be getting better and I'm doing less, but we have to go to that place of less first to really learn these like core things that we didn't learn as children.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally relate to this, because my journey for sure over these last couple of years has been working on so many different levels of my experience, the mental, emotional, spiritual, energetic, right? And it was probably, we started talking about this about 6 months ago. And I think this is really powerful to say here, because at this point, it probably was about 6 months ago when I started to really dive into nervous system stuff and think about it a lot more, and attachment work and all that kind of thing. And it was at a place where like my brain was starting to, from neurofeedback, like we could see that the numbers were like, they're holding, your brain is getting better. It's stabilizing. Like, you're doing the thing. Your brain's doing a good job, Carrie. And I'm like, well, my brain's doing a good job, Carrie. Why am I still in this struggle with certain things? Like, why is my mind still looping? Why am I still feeling anxious? Why? Like, my brain isn't sending that then at some level, because like my brain's stable. It's not telling it like that I'm freaked out. Right. So what's in me then? What's the next piece? And that's when I started to realize, because like I could still feel this anxiety that was still like, it was a constant. I think this is what you're talking about in that Fox thing. And I'm going to say this and you can correct me, but it was like a constant, just underlying. It wasn't necessarily, oh my God, I can't do anything, but this constant underlying like anxiety. And so for me, it then came to, how do I calm my nervous system? And I knew, especially with the work that I'd been doing over the last few years, all the stuff that I've done with the books and the podcasts and the work, and, like I'd been running so fast, and all of a sudden I was like, slow the fuck down, slow the heck down and just be. And it took me like literally going, you have to just be. There's no reason that anything, and like the timelines that I could put on myself, or the pressure that I could put on myself. And sometimes it didn't make any difference to how long the output actually took. But the pressure that I put on myself to meet the output made me like, oh my God, we gotta go. My nervous system was like, what the fuck are you doing? Right? But we think, because I'm like, I was so much better than I ever had been, and I could hold these pieces now. I was like, okay, I can learn how to not lose my shit. Right? I got that piece and I could hold these two, but then I couldn't quite shift that. And so I would love for you to talk about, because this was huge. I mean, it was only 2 weeks ago this post came out that I actually understood what you were talking about with co-regulation. And I was like, oh, and I realized how much I had done this over the last year to co-regulate in different places. But I would love for you to talk about the importance of this, because I think this is like this huge link that I'm like, oh, really important in being able to then go and regulate when you're in that place. You're like, I'm doing it. I'm here. I'm holding these things, but I still feel like unregulated. I still feel,
Yeah. Ooh, I feel like from what you just shared about your own personal experience, and also to recognize that no one nervous system is the same. So no one experience and no one result or no one way is going to be exactly the same. I feel like the reason why a lot of people don't like to do this work is because it's uncomfortable. So you got to the point where you're like, my brain's healed, but I still have this crazy level of anxiety sitting at the surface. Most people get to that point and it's so uncomfortable. That's where they stop, or that's where they quit, or that's where they're just like, no, I don't want to do this because this is too much. This is too much, too soon, too fast, too uncomfortable to sit in this level of anxiety. So there's a couple different ways to work with that. One, I think, and I'm learning more of different kinds of plant medicines that can help with that. I do think that having a guide that has the capacity and has the understanding of trauma resolution and nervous system regulation is really important. I also feel like seeking out somatic coaches, somatic therapists that have the understanding of how the nervous system works, and ask your questions, people. Like, when you go meet a therapist or when you go talk to a coach, and if this is what you want to work on, ask your questions, because a lot of people say they do nervous system work or they do these things. They really don't. Not in the capacity that you might need. In your case, Carrie, finding someone that has a regulated nervous system, working with someone that does have a regulated nervous system, someone that understands it or has experienced it, so that they can kind of walk you through it.
I think for me, and that's what I was saying, like the post basically said a few weeks ago was exactly what you just said, was basically like, unless you have a regulated nervous system to meet, your nervous system doesn't know how to actually be different because it's the experience it has. So until you've met the regulated nervous system, your nervous system will continuously play how it's playing. And so what I started to realize when I started thinking about this, just in the last, 24, 48 hours, was around how many people have shown up in my life over this last year that have been the most grounded, like totally regulated humans. And I'm like, of course. And then I just go and like, okay. And it has shown me each step of the way, this is how it's supposed to feel, Carrie. This is how it's supposed to feel, Carrie.
It goes to that like example from the baby, from the birth trauma, where everyone in the room is dysregulated, or baby just had a trauma and mom was dysregulated. And so they attune and become imprinted at a dysregulated nervous system. The same is true for our regulated nervous system. So if you're with someone, and I love this saying, whatever the strongest energy is in the room, that's where the energy will go. So if you walk into a room, or if you meet a client and you have, even if they're spinning out of control and they're in this very anxious space, if the other person is holding stronger than that, a calm, grounded, regulated nervous system, this person that's spinning out of control is just going to eventually be like, okay, all right, okay. And they attune to the stronger energy. And so, I mean, really, that's why doing nervous system work is so important to me, because if we have more people in the world with more regulated nervous systems that have the stronger energy, everyone's going to start attuning to that stronger energy. And what's happening right now are the people in power and the people that the news show, and the way that we move through the world is we're attuning to people that are completely dysregulated, and highlighting all the leaders. All the bullshit right now is highlighting people who do not have regulated nervous systems. And so what do? We attune to that. That's why I don't watch the news.
Right. Absolutely.
Like, I don't need their nervous systems dictating my nervous system. No, I'm not open for that.
It's interesting. It actually makes me think of protection of nervous system, and like being mindful of where you put yourself, like there are places that for sure you may be like, you just feel like I don't want to be there. And so often, right, then you might pass through that and you'll be like, why did I go? And you'll feel like really uncomfortable when you came home. And it's probably because you were in a room with people whose, nervous systems weren't.
Our bodies know. Our bodies know if there's a part of you that's like, something's weird about that person. I mean, of course, it's also an opportunity to be like, what's triggering me? What's here? And if there's a part of you screaming, red light flashing, don't hang out with that person. Don't go to that event. Don't go in that room. There's usually a reason why. Like, our body knows, and it's really hard to listen to what our body knows if we're not in a regulated state.
So can you share maybe to wrap this up, a couple tips, ideas, ways that people can, even just at home now, start to play with regulating their nervous systems and yeah.
For me, what opened the door for me is meditation. And I started meditating when I was in graduate school and was spinning out of control. really stressed out, convinced I was going to fail out of my second semester of grad school. It was a really rigorous program, lots of science. And so I started sitting down to music, playing music, and visualizing myself graduating 3 years later. That's what I would do for meditation. And at the time, I didn't know like meditation was even really a thing. And I got straight A's that semester and was like, okay, I was fine. And I recognized like, oh, wow, when I sit down every night and put on some calm music and just sit here and imagine the things I want, and I'm just with myself, I feel better. And then fast forward years later, when I read a book about meditation and got really into meditation and started to understand what it really is doing for the brain. What meditation does for the brain is like literally brain changing, life changing what it does. So I always tell people to meditate, and there's some resistance. People are like, yeah. And other people are like, yeah. So that was my doorway in to the nervous system regulation. There's other doorways in. There's breath work. There's working with practitioners, working with other people that have regulated nervous systems and understand this, like coaches, therapists, body workers, certain types of
recommended. Highly recommended.
Yeah, like myofascial, cranial, sacral. But if you're at home and you're like, I can't go anywhere, I'm home, I have lots of kids, set a timer on your phone 3 times a day. And when that timer goes off, stop and be like, what's my body doing right now? What's my mind doing? Am I racing? Am I disconnected? Am I in my body? Where are my thoughts? Where's my breath? Where's my heart rate? And just start to be curious, like, what's happening right now? And start to pay attention. And then once you do a check-in, just take a few moments to breathe, or like take a few moments to squeeze your shoulders, give yourself some squeezes, touch your face, touch your lips release oxytocin, touch the back of your neck and massage like right where the skull meets the neck. Just take a few minutes and just pause. I mean, this really doesn't take that long, and then go on with your day.
I will say I've had this practice for about 9 months now. I have alarms that go off on my phone, and the alarm says, how do you feel? And if you've listened to this podcast long enough, there have been a couple of podcasts where it has gone off in the middle of the podcast. So you've probably heard it. And it's for that exact reason. It's just this check-in point to be like, how am I feeling right now? What is happening in my body? Do I need to do anything to service my body? Right? Like, do I just need to have a breath? Do I need to have some water? What's going on? Like for me, because we can be so outwardly to everybody else and doing. It's just like this moment in the day to be like, let me check in with me.
Yeah, I'm going to bring my orientation to internal and just be with whatever it is. And an acronym I love to think about is, funny enough, it's called COAL, COAL. Totally blanking who this comes from. It's a meditation teacher that's well known, but curious, open, accepting, loving. Just come in, you're curious, what's here? I'm open to whatever's here. I'm going to accept whatever's here, and I'm going to love whatever is here. If it needs a little bit of love, great.
I swear that could be an entire show on that. It almost feels like horrible to close there. Because I'm like, it's so true. If you take that into yourself, but also into every other communication that you have, your life will change.
Totally.
Your life will change.
It will. It totally will. Ripple effect, baby. It's all about the ripple effect.
All right, Miss Leash, how can people find you in your amazingness? And honestly, anyone who's listening, Leash is amazing. She does do this work. If you are wanting someone to work with, I highly recommend her. We didn't even get really into the womby work. I shouldn't say womby. It's womb work, people, because other people might not know what womby is. Womb work. And Leash is just magical. So how do people find you if they want to work with you?
Thank you, Carrie. My website is my name, leshanelson.com. I am way more active on Instagram than Facebook. You can kind of find me on Facebook here and there, but I'm really fun on Instagram, and I offer all sorts of free content. You can sign up for my newsletter. I don't bombard you. I send out like really yummy, juicy newsletters, and I have a fun podcast called Nurturing Resilience, where people share their story of resilience. So any one of those places is a great way to connect with me and find me.
That reminds me, I'll come and play on your podcast too. We have to remember to do that. Amazing, 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 amazing. Thank you so much, Leash. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I am so grateful for anyone who is listening. This was a lot. Like, it was a really big, deep conversation. There was a lot in here. We are both, like, obviously I am not the trauma / nervous system person. I am just on my own journey, and Leash has been a beautiful support for me. And if you have any questions, reach out to me, reach out to Lesha. We will do whatever we can to support you on this journey and to help you find the resources that you need to be able to do this, because it will change your life.
It does, for sure. Thanks so much for having me on today, Carrie.
Thanks. My pleasure, Leash. And for everybody else, we'll see you next week.